Okay, starting with 3, 2, 1, go. 4-point model. 1, we're happy to have Supreme Courts decide whether a given law restricts individual freedoms. We think it should be relatively liberal when doing this and in favor of defending freedoms. Secondly, we're happy to devolve referenda to local levels if there are large, substantial areas which have their own legislatures, for instance, like a canton can have its own referendum. Thirdly, in the case that there is a dire need for speed, you have to decide the policy tomorrow because it's a breakout, we're happy for emergency laws to go into place that last something like 2 weeks, a month. And then if you want to keep going for months and months like you're doing in Montreal, only then do we think a referendum needs to take place if there is such a demand. Fourthly, we're happy to have things like at-home voting, and we'll try and get USPS not to lose most of the ballots just to make sure it's not particularly unsafe to have this referendum. First argument on principle, we think this should be a democratic choice. The first thing to point out is that there's no a priori conception of what good public health policy is, because it includes a large number of valid trade-offs. For instance, to have massive shutdowns enormously impedes on people's abilities to make jobs, for businesses to function, especially in poorer countries where you can't have the federal government print a ton of money because they believe the dollar is good enough to allow them to do this. So by deciding to protect the most vulnerable, the people who are immunocompromised, you are making a ton of people poorer, hungrier, less able to live themselves and likely to die substantially shorter. Secondly, most of these policies tend to have substantial mental health outcomes, except for masking, right? All of the other impositions require people to see their friends less, not to go into jobs, stay at home a lot, and I think it does, for the vast majority of people, have a large substantial impact upon them. But thirdly, often there are individual reasons why people oppose policies that are hard to argue about. If you're religious, you might not want vaccination. If you're African American and you've grown up in a culture where your people were experimented on, you again are maybe more likely to distrust vaccinations, and it's kind of hard to say, well, you're just being irrational, why don't you get it and understand the science like everybody else? There are obviously dumb preferences, right? But I don't think we should rely on some central government to evaluate what those are, because it's always idiosyncratic what people's preferences are and why they should come into place. So, secondly, given there are trade-offs, what is the best way of legislating on this? I'd like to notice the comparative under their side cannot be never allowing individuals' preferences, freedoms to be violated. Because in those cases, they are implicitly excluding a huge number of people from accessing the public space, because they make the opposite problem of saying if you're immunocompromised, you can never go into public. Which means that we need some way of evaluating what the valid moral preferences and moral trade-offs are. We don't think that opening opposition is gifted with some moral endowment that allows only them to determine what morality is. The only reasonable thing to do is to aggregate people's morality for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because procedurally it is bad to determine that any one person should be in charge of deciding what is best for people. And that is primarily the argument for democracy, which is even if opening opposition are a benevolent dictator, they don't get a fiat, that is always likely to be the case. But secondly, it's obviously a slippery slope. If the argument is individual freedoms are fine to be curtailed as long as there is some social good, where does that end? It also applies to things like free speech to the extent they destabilize the economy. So absent some very clear limit on where freedoms should end, and then basically to prove that in all cases the kind of trade-offs we talk about are not valid, they have to defend an autocracy under their side of the house. The comparison, under their side, when you end up devolving this to governments, it is always less likely to be democratic. Why? Because, one, they are usually not elected on this specific issue. So in the best case you have a democratic government, you voted for the party because you wanted them to run the economy, you had no idea that there was going to be a pandemic where all of these policies would come into effect, which means that functionally you are not voting on this particular issue. So even if it's not the worst case, it is a democracy, there are some incentive to account to people's preferences, it is less democratic, and the question of what is the most democratic issue is the most important impact in the round by virtue of my first frame, in which we don't know what the most important impacts are likely to be. But secondly, this is precisely the kind of decision that should be a referendum. One, there are easy to understand trade-offs, that is, there is no need to understand the economy or how interest rates work. It is merely a question of, do we care more about this actor or this actor and the different impacts that people have? But secondly, because it's binary, it doesn't involve negotiations, we just either have a lockdown or not. So we tell you this is precisely the kind of instance in which referenda are likely to be good. So I think for those reasons, our principle is outweighing. I'll take up here where I can close it.
Yeah, so you seem to think there's an important place for the play for the Supreme Court. On what grounds? And so far, mainly their job is to protect a minority to avoid a tyranny of the majority.
This is just a procedural issue. If you that point in the model, I'm not that keen on. If you want some other way for deciding if it would violate individual rights, I'm happy to. But we are saying in most instances there should be a referendum. Secondly, on better policy under our side of the house. One, we get a hugely greater level of buy-in. One, because we're actually able to set a more accurate level of policy for two reasons. One, politicians often listen to the people that campaign to them the most because they don't have a good sense of what people's preferences on any individual issue are, absent the ability to do polling, which is also very inaccurate because the most vocal people are more likely to turn out to polls. But secondly, because we're more able to delegate like power to individual areas in a way that doesn't happen when you have things like national electorates existing under their side of the House. For instance, we're happy to give Montreal the ability to set their own policy if there are a lot of old people living there. For those reasons, I think you're more likely to just have the level of policy set that benefits individual people when they vote specifically on this issue. By contrast, I think in most cases, governments lean towards being relatively lenient on these policies because they perceive anti-maskers to be a much more large group of the population. Because all people who really, really care, it tends to be people who are about to die because they're immunocompromised, which is a tiny proportion of people, or people who've been radicalized to believe that any imposition of their freedoms is appalling, but the second group is much larger, which means that in general, politicians will sway towards not caring about the immunocompromised people. Yes?
We create a giant group action problem, and that to the extent that people are able to have very lax restrictions in one part of the country and then travel to other parts of the country and spread shit, then no individual place is incentivized to have like strong crackdowns because it doesn't work unless everyone does it.
Yeah, but the problem is that people don't move that frequently, right? Like, I'm not going to like, I want to go clubbing, I'm going to move to another area 600 miles away to do that on a plane. And you could have some restrictions that say, if you come here, we'll make you do a 14-day quarantine and get a PCR test was $100. So I don't think that genuinely is such a big problem under your side of the House. Secondly, because I think people are less likely to view this in a partisan way, because now there is not incentive for people to try and oppose the other party when parties individually have to justify why they, as individual people who are elected and Democrats, decide to vote their way. When it gets devolved, it is more likely instead that charities that represent immunocompromised people or the scientific community directly campaign. For instance, a similar thing happened in Brexit, whereas both major parties to some extent split, and rather than advocating specifically for this, that while it was a bad time for everyone, was not as partisan as other elections tend to be. The impact on people are much more likely to follow the rules because they believe they are reasonable and they believe that the other person believes they're reasonable rather than some partisan deal. I think this is huge because your desire to follow the rules is largely based on whether or not you think you're going to be judged and whether other people respect the rules. These arguments suggest why most likely we get rules followed. Given rules in general are very hard to enforce, you can't go into people's homes unless you're a police state and just like barge in, arrest everyone if they don't happen to be that in the household. By and large, you rely on people's enforcement and social stigma, making sure that this happens. We get this better. But secondly, we get more scientific policy under our side of the House, like more objectively good policy. Why? Because one, we're less likely to get partisanship that creates additional space for scientific people under our side of the House. But secondly, the reason I've already given you suggests that we're more likely to go in favor of protecting vulnerable minorities if you care about. The final reason we protect vulnerable minorities is that they tend to congregate. Old people live in the same place because they all retire there for the cheaper taxes. Which means this area in particular can protect themselves because of our default mechanism. In general, we protect vulnerable people. We have democracy. Plan to propose.
Mr. Prime Minister, and invite the leader of the opposition to present his whole view.
The info slide tells us that a mask mandate is a limit on someone's liberty. I would contend that being on a fucking ventilator is a limit on your liberty that is categorically unlike the things we're talking about on their side. I would argue that in this debate, and I'm just going to say this off the top, it's not a key part of my case, that every time I talk about people dying and getting COVID, I want you to think to yourself, limitations on liberty, right? Because when you are like unable to breathe, hospitalized, when you you're unable, dead, your ability to make decisions about your life, things that are essential to freedom, are undercut in ways that are categorically larger than things like mask mandates, vaccine mandates, etc. Your bodily autonomy is more restricted when you get COVID and have to be hospitalized than any of that. So just first off the top, okay. First constructive argument on logistics and how this is a horrible policy logistically. It's like 7 subpoints. First one, on timeliness and responsiveness to changes. It is extremely time-consuming and expensive to run a referendum. I think the last Canadian election cost something like $100 million, something crazy, right? And we now need to run these referenda every single time. We need to make massive policy changes in updates to new COVID data, right? Because these things change frequently. So we're going to have monthly, $100 million elections that are extremely costly, especially in places, for example, India, where running an election requires sending people out to extremely remote areas so that everyone in the country is actually able to meaningfully cast a vote. The other thing here, so the consequence of this is that you get policy change that is heavily delayed because you have to wait until you're able to put the organizational infrastructure together for a referendum, actually run it, count all the votes, etc. Or it's just not done at all because the government evaluates that the cost of the referenda is so high that it undercuts any benefits you get. Also, to the extent that this is true, all of this delay comes at the cost of human life. Right? When countries aren't able to act quickly, people die. It's like that simple. Also, when you have these like referenda this frequently, voter turnout goes down a lot. Generally, when you have like multiple elections in a row, people are like less willing to turn out. That generally means that you don't get very much representativeness. It's one of many reasons why standard elections that we advocate for are better ways of hearing what people have to say. Third thing on safety. They say that we're going to have mail-in ballots. Tons of places both lack the infrastructure for mail-in ballots. Lots of places don't have even roads or like infrastructure to mail things out. But also, so it's very likely you'll need in-person booths. Or there are places where they could do mail-in ballots, but due to political pressures, they're unlikely to do so because certain parties might benefit from not doing it because it will skew votes in a certain way. Meaning that it is highly likely you have referenda where people have to show up to the ballot box at risk of being exposed to COVID and also structurally eliminating certain types of people from voting, i.e. immunocompromised people or people that work with immunocompromised people are not going to want to vote when voting has a very marginal impact on the outcome of policy, but could mean that they literally die. So I think the extent to which you represent the most marginal people is tiny on their side. Also, you have group action problems. And I think this goes without saying. We cannot reasonably build a border around the island of Montreal to stop people from outside that have crazy policies from coming in and infecting us. It is just true that people will go to a neighboring city and party and come back, to the extent that now passing a COVID policy like a mask mandate or like shutdown does not help you very much because people can just leave your city to go clubbing, come back and spread it to your community. You have a group action problem where people are unable to pass policy that is life-saving, even when that policy would be popular amongst people, and people would be willing to make that trade-off. Finally, under logistics, you have an information access problem, which is the public is generally not very well informed, unlike politicians who have experts that can talk to them. States have still not figured out how to run around massive fake news propaganda campaigns, and we're going to talk more about how this becomes a greater problem. But generally, until we figure out ways to like actually meaningfully educate people on these issues, and they're going to have to prove that we get around all the fake news that's currently circulating, which states haven't figured out to do, it's probably not representative of what the public actually wants. Why is the status quo fine? I would say representative democracy is very politically accountable, right? It's about having politically accountable people that are in office, that are voted in, able to make decisions in the interest of people quickly with access to the information of experts, right? There's a reason why citizens don't vote on all bills. And it's not just that it's like inefficient, which it is, and a logical extension of their principle is that we should have referenda on every single criminal law because that involves a restriction of people's freedom, and probably like every tax thing because we're literally taking people's money, whatever, like etc. It's like ludicrous, right? We're going back to like ancient Greece on their side of the house, and it's something that's pretty good for people. You also and have access to information. So this means that this is why pretty much every country has an Emergency Measures Act that is generally popular that enables states in times of crisis, like a global pandemic, to act quickly. What it means being able to save lives. Why do we think this is going to be reasonably accountable? I think politicians have a massive incentive to get this right. This is clearly going to be the political issue of the next election, right? COVID is probably the biggest single voting issue in any country on earth. To the extent that you do a good job as a politician by following, for example, guidance of public health officials, doing the utilitarian weighing about vulnerable people, for example, your probability of getting back into office is huge. Politicians that acted in a way that was seen as within the views of in line with people's values saw massive surges in popularity in polls and were generally had extremely high popularity ratings in a very similar way to politicians getting reelected in wartime. The incentives you have to conform to people's values are very high. Sure, I'll take a moment.
Yeah, ancient Greece or Switzerland, representative delegates can make the exact same decisions that we guys can. The only difference is we're giving them a mandate. This is what happened in America. Democratically elected politicians fucked up the pandemic.
So you need to have referenda every single time you want to make policy. I'll see all my logistical arguments. This doesn't respond to any of it. Actually, we'll take a POI from top half instead.
So we can say that this is exactly the kind of thing that should be a referendum, whereas almost all of the arguments you gave, maybe 2 out of 7 are not, are arguments against democracy in general.
It's arguments against... Okay, I just don't think that's true. I'm not sure why it would be true. In this case, we would say that having infrequent elections where you have people people are actually able to have the time to get properly informed on issues, where you're able to have more time for the public to educate themselves, I think where you're able to then have people that are able to respond dynamically to changing circumstances is probably substantially better. On social divides, I think you're probably going to get massive polarization that is distinct from other types of democracy. So I think that this is because of a few things. When you have a yes-no binary on public health issues, you enable people to be polarized around that issue and create incentives for those with economic stake in one side or the other to propagandize to one or the other. The distinction here is that if you have something, for example, like nonpartisan technocrats or bipartisan agreement on certain policy, that incentive to do that degree of lobbying and create that degree of propaganda is less so because it just doesn't do very much. If you propagandize people against Anthony Fauci, it can't do that much in an election. Whereas if you have a referendum coming up next week, the ability that it has to like influence people is greater. This creates massive divides amongst people. There are literally people in Quebec that will not talk to each other because of the fucking 1994 referendum. Like, the degree to which this polarizes people is terrible. In the context of COVID, this means you have people that are polarized against certain things, that even when they pass, means you have terrible compliance because people have been polarized against it. Finally, on the principle, I think probably, like, we think that things should be representative. I think a politician that can weigh things is better than a referendum where everyone has the equal vote, from people that don't like wearing masks because it makes them uncomfortable to people that will fucking die if they don't have this policy passed. I think this is a terrible way to do the policy, where somebody that can actually make the weighing is more accountable to people very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the leader of the opposition, and now we invite the next defendant.
It's really unfortunate that O decides to debate the least charitable possible version of this proposal. They complain about things like time and speed, about political manipulation, and about, like, for example, taking a new referenda every time the situation changes. Plausibly, I think that governments are going to do this in a reasonable way. So first of all, for example, doing things like saying we'll have a mask mandate every time the infection rate rises above 2%, for example, or other general heuristics like that. The second thing is just that obviously things like state infrastructure and other barriers vary across contexts. So if we're concerned about voting in India or Pakistan, for example, like plausibly there are problems of direct democracy, indirect democracy also cross apply. Like, it's much, much harder to hold Modi accountable, for example, which means plausibly like he disproportionately direct resources towards states that he's more popular in, therefore neglecting others. So like definitely going to be some obstacles on our side, but they're much, much better than on their side. I would actually say that problems of like democracy being twisted are worse, i.e. the potential for like misuse on their side is worse than the potential for incompetence on our side, because at worst, like the consequences on our side are less like harshly enforced, if that makes sense, because state infrastructure is not quite as strong, whereas on their side they defend active repression and harm. The final thing then is it's also just like kind of disingenuous for them to talk about very, very black and white comparisons, right? Because they say things such as like being on a ventilator is like the worst possible thing that could happen to you. They don't just defend things like good health policies during times of absolute crisis. They're talking about public health in general. So they defend things such as imposing lockdown or having mask mandates in contexts where millions of Americans are really, really depressed. Booster rates are quite high, and where plausibly the urgency on their side just doesn't exist. And the final thing is just like, we already trade off representation and time all the time, right? Because in democracies, like politicians poll, they do temperature checks, they try and figure out what's going on. On our side, what we're saying is that we're willing to trade off a little bit more of that time in order to capture that representation, but it's really not as radical as they think it is. So the TLDR is, okay, it's extremely unfair, a bit nitpicky, probably not in this round. See you.
Yeah, so if everything is some kind of trade-off, can you explain uniquely what makes this trade-off one that needs to be put to the people in the referendum versus all the other policies that government pass regularly that infringe upon people's liberties?
Yes, that is what I'll be endeavoring to prove in my speech. So the first clash then is about why exactly answering this TOI. So the first one establishes, I'm not going to do a ton of weighing or impacting for this clash, because I really think explaining why we get the best decisions is the controlling link for this round. And the idea is that objectively good decisions that maximize utility do exist, i.e. you minimize human suffering and you maximize human thriving. The O comparison claim is that, well, it's really not that clear, it's not really ambiguous, because being on a ventilator is something that constrains your personal liberty more than anything else. The thing is though, the 0.002% chance of being on a ventilator versus the 100% chance of being forced to inject a foreign substance into your body is a trade-off that I think is much, much more reasonable. And I think for those reasons, it's not always the case that the strictest policies are the best, i.e., we all the time do things like there are marginal decreasing returns to caution. We're willing to ride in cars, even though it might risk the absolute worst case scenario of dying, because we think the bonus to our utility, happiness, convenience is just worth it, and people should be able to make that decision for themselves. So our claim here is then that referendum is way, way, way better at approximating and reaching the optimum balance than their counterfactual. So the first thing then is, why is direct versus direct democracy so much better than indirect policy in this context specifically? I think the reason for this is because we generally recognize that direct representation is something that we're entitled to as human beings, right? Like, we're forced to do things the state makes us do. It's pretty unfortunate. It really, really constrains the things we can do as actors. We're probably better off in other contexts. And we should have some control over what's happening to us, right? The thing is, though, we allow exceptions to be made to this when it's just really, really not that important, or when it's very, very difficult for you to make those choices. So this is things such as like directly affecting financial policy, and tax policy and that kind of thing. The problem with that is there are several degrees of removal between the individual person and the outcome of that policy. It's very, very macro. On the other hand, limiting individual liberties. So telling you to put a mask on when you leave your house is something that very, very directly affects what you do on a day-to-day level and requires a degree of consent and participation that other things don't. The second main thing I would say is that governments are very, very shit at evaluating what people's preferences are. And the reason for this is they're biased by the resources around them. I.e., when people around me, my advisors, are talking about my approval ratings in XYZ county, it's very, very difficult for me to get my mind off that and look at the objective big picture, because I'm after all concerned with my own political survival and I pursue those things instead. The third thing is that partisanship means that even individual people who they're relying on to make good undirect democracy decisions really, really distorts your ability to make decisions that are best for yourself. Because instead of thinking, do I actually want to risk being put in hospital, for example, you think, fuck this, the Democrats are trying to put me into this, into this prison, I refuse to be oppressed, etc., etc. It becomes a very, very emotive, irrational kind of decision that people might end up regretting in the long term. And the fourth thing is just that people form much, much, much better opinions when they're given agency and control over a choice. Because on their side, and in the status quo, oftentimes, we just respond to decisions that are forced upon us. So all we register is the discomfort that happens when we're forced to take vaccines, for example. On the other hand, though, when you are choosing between two options, this means you're much more serious and reflective about which one has the better harms.
So I just think that politicians are probably able to get support based on holistic outcomes, i.e. politicians that saw dramatic decreases in COVID cases in their country without hurting people too much were extremely popular and won re-election. I'm just unsure why this isn't something that can hold people accountable to a reasonable extent.
That seems like mitigation, but even if they have the incentive to, they don't have capacity to, as I said. And the third thing is just that many, many countries, this just did not happen, so, Okay, so the final thing then is, yeah, people form much better opinions because they're actually choosing to decide what happens to them. They understand what consequences are, and that's good. So the impact of that is obviously we win the round. So the final thing I want to talk about is then the idea of health, right? So a few things here, policies become better, as I said, but two, people are much, much more willing to obey them and buy into them. Because the idea isn't that I'm being forced to do this by this shadowy government agency, but rather that, we had a vote, people around me had these opinions as well, and I'm being made to do this, but I kind of see the logic behind it because there was so much discussion about what is and isn't a good idea. But the final thing is also we clear up resources that are currently spent catering to people and instead allow them to be directed towards vulnerable minority groups who otherwise would be neglected and left behind. The controlling factor isn't whether we know they want to be helped, but rather whether we have these resources in the first place.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, and now we would like back to the of your position to close off the first part of this debate. Thank you.
Opening government asserts that there's no public health consensus on how to best deal with health emergencies. This is just blatantly false. There's actually a pretty well-known public health principle that tells us that we should err towards safety and quick reactions, even in the face of incomplete data, when the trade-off is between potential life-threatening disease and restrictions on liberty. This is something that was actually adhered to by the vast majority of countries that implemented public health policies. The question here is not, did they do it perfectly? The question is, would the citizens have done it better or worse? And we tell you, we're the only people who give you mechanistic analysis on why it will be worse. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of idea of giving a mandate to voters, both in terms of the access to information they have, but also in terms of the likely decisions that they're going to make, and why both of those are actually both less democratic, so less in line with the principle that opening government gives us, but also less likely to be adhered to in ways that are likely to undermine things going forward. Then some reputation rebuilding. So first let's talk about access to information and compare voters and politicians in this regard, right? Because recognize that if opening government's principle is about democracy and representation, but we show you why in this instance voters are better at adhering to indirect democracy to have their needs met, then I think we win that clash, right? So what do voters have access to? Recognize that this is a rapidly evolving situation that has tons of public health information that elected officials literally pay to go through, have staff who are hired to interpret that information to get there, who consult with public officials, etc. Why does this matter? It matters because if we compare this to voters who are being asked to vote for something apparently within a couple of weeks, because if not, the mandate expires, they are being rushed with information that's hard for them to adhere to. They're in a public health crisis where they're probably caring for loved ones, working overtime, have no way to interpret information. So the question is, and the thing that OG never responds to is, why are they going to interpret this in a way that is reasonable to them? We are unsure, right? In especially the era of COVID, where so many people have been faced with massive propaganda campaigns, with conspiracy theorizing, with worries about vaccines with OG flags, we would say that they're actually likely to have more widespreading of propaganda and false information. That means that they're likely to make decisions that would undermine them. Compare this to elected officials then, because the reason we have elected officials is because they have the time and ability to aggregate our preferences, to aggregate the things that we're probably going to want, and also to consider things like vulnerable actors who, if they all die in their constituencies, these people are never getting reelected, in ways that individual people cannot make. But the other thing is they can do so holistically. So whereas voters might be voting for, say, do we go into lockdown or not, the elected official can say, okay, we're going to lockdown, but we're going to have, for example, money that is being sent to every individual that will support them during that lockdown. They can look at things holistically and assess whether or not that's going to be good. But if you are put to the vote about the restriction to your liberty, that is a restriction to going into lockdown or not. You vote against that, even though holistically it would actually be beneficial for you. Only the elected official can make that assessment. But two, why is this going to be good? Actually, first I'll take OG.
It might be the case that politicians having access to correct information would be sufficient to outweigh the benefits under our side of knowing what people's correct preferences are, if politicians' incentive were mostly to listen to public health advisors. But Republicans never had this incentive, so democracy is the best that we can do.
Okay, so a couple things. First of all, I'm going to explain a little bit more why you don't get the representation that you think you do in elections because of your own model. But second of all, I'll talk about why the question isn't, are Republicans doing a good job? It's, are their electorate going to do a worse job, right? That's a comparative you don't engage with, which is why you're out of the debate. In terms of the reasons that you don't have the democracy that you have is all the things Jacob gives you that you don't respond to, right? Why vulnerable individuals and people who are the most marginalized, the people you talk to who are afraid of vaccines, are the people who are often shut out from voting in the first place. You're not going to have their voices heard in meaningful ways. What you're going to have is people who are very in support of the mandate or very into the propaganda who are voting on things that isn't in a way that is representative. Secondly, Jacob tells you why these politicians have a lot of structural reasons to make very good decisions about the pandemic. This doesn't mean it's going to be a perfect decision. This means, though, that when they're looking at the information they have, they probably ask themselves, in 2 years when I'm going up to election, is the result of the pandemic likely to be one in which I can stand by and say that I did something that protected people? Why do they care about that? A couple of reasons. One, this is going to be the voting issue for the vast majority of countries post-campaign, right? A lot of people have elections during the pandemic. Hopefully just one because they're massively unsafe. But even if it's afterwards, it's going to be a referendum on did they do a good job. But those people have 20/20 vision. They can say, how many of my neighbors died compared to another country? Or how many died compared to what was projected to have died, right? how many of my people like were injured, right? So you're likely to have people who are erring on the side of caution, who are erring on the side of public health, because you are more likely to vote out somebody because somebody you care about was in the ER for 6 months, versus because somebody restricted your access to mask mandates. That means they're more likely to align with public health than people who have inaccurate access to information, and in which you don't have the time to change their minds on those things. Which reminds me, it kind of brings me to the issue of the people who are distrusting. You don't have the time during that kind of 2 weeks or month to massively change their minds on those things. It's in implementing the policy that they start to integrate why those things matter, why it's not that bad to wear a mask, and they're willing to buy into it down the line to vote you in next time. See you.
The key to successful public health surveillance is not the first lockdown, it's the third one. And the only way that you can maintain public stamina for it is if the public owns its own decision. That's the deadlock.
So, but the issue is that, one, if that public is willing to recognize 6 months later that that was the right decision, then politicians will still come to the correct conclusion. In the alternative, right, for example, South Africa implementing a curfew that nobody cared about and that had no public health reasoning, they backed out of it real quick when they realized it didn't have backing, because they want to do things that in retrospect are likely to be seen as reasonable, but likely to be seen as erring to protect individuals. That is what we side with, and that's what we think most people tend to support down the ballot. Okay, a few extra points of refutation then. In terms of the model, our point is not to nitpick at your model. Our point is to show you that there are structural reasons why you undercut your own principles of democracy. Either, because they tell us basically you'll temporarily implement this, but either you need enough time to be able to run an information campaign that tells people and informs people that thing, which means you're undercutting your principle of democracy because you've imposed a vaccine on them for 6 months before you have them vote on it. Or it expires because you don't have the time, or during that time it's not viewed as legitimate, so no one follows the mask mandate because there hasn't been a referendum then, and nobody supports it. Even if the referendum passes, we would say the divisiveness and the rhetoric and the propaganda that is spread over a yes-no thing, saying masks are up for debate, vaccines are up for debate, and that's the only thing we talk about at the dinner table, means that you're likely to not adhere to it, even if it passes, which means that regionally, if Montreal doesn't have a mandate, everybody else is also screwed. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the position. And now we call upon the member for the government.
The premise from opening opposition, and I'm sorry if my voice is a little hoarse, but the premise from opening opposition that opening government never challenges is that in this election, about citizen that you have every 6 years, 5 years, I don't care, that the only issue on the ballot is COVID. This is nonsensical, this is absurdist, and this is just not empirically true. The extension from our case is going to be absurdly simple. Why you actually do have buy-in, why the only way to get sustained buy-in is to hold elections, and why it is impossible to actually narrow down the issues that you care about to one COVID pandemic or not. I want to premise this with a very simple argument. The vast majority of groups that are discussing COVID in the mainstream public sphere are extreme. That is to say, they are anti-democratic in the largest sense, because, as both opening government and opening opposition admit, these are relatively small percentages of the population. I would point out that the reason why right-wingers are much more vocal and able to get change in response to their protests is because the vulnerable groups that actually do want things like lockdowns are literally unable to go around and chase it for fear of themselves being injured or falling susceptible to the pandemic, which is, by the way, why most countries actually do overreact to protesters, because they make a larger portion of the people that are actively calling you every single day. But more importantly, there is literally no avenue for public debate aside from this. As this is to say, there is no referendum on the election that happens regularly, so your only exposure to it in non-election periods is the protests that, as we pointed out, are undemocratic, bad, unrepresentative, and make worse policy. That's simple. That is, by the way, their best case scenario. That is 9 times out of 10, you are not in an election year, so you do make bad policy. Because a politician is not dumb enough to say, I'm only going to do things that I think are going to be good in 5 years from now. They respond to what people actually say, because when constituents are calling you and saying, we're going to remember this and not vote for you in 2 years, you actually do make those changes. You are representative to what the people who are protesting, the small minority, actually doing. The second thing I want to point out is why you cannot solve this in an election. The reason you can't solve this in an election is extraordinarily simple. 40% of American voters are single issue. They have one issue that they care about. Something like 30 to 40% of Republican voters do not care about whether or not a politician supports gun rights. They just care about things like abortion. And those things are so important. Because what actually happens is the vast majority of people do support things like COVID policy. In California, 60-70% of voters approve of COVID policy. The same thing happened in Switzerland. But the difference you get is on their side, you make it much worse. Because there are other random issues that happen in elections. Like in the 2020 elections, COVID made up like 10% of the election like news on like media at any given point in time. Because it didn't matter what happened in COVID. Here are two reasons why. One, there are literally just so many other issues. You have to talk about guns. You have to talk about like whether or not the Democrats are soft on crime. You talk about them court packing. But two, and more importantly, it is so easy for you as a politician to sidestep the issues that are actually relevant. Because you can say, you don't need to accept whether or not you've been on the pandemic. You turn it back on Sleepy Joe and allowing all the racial protests of 2020, you say, that was the cause of violence. It is those things that are bad. Because that is a far more salient impact to the vast majority of people who then sidestep the issue entirely, because now it's not about the COVID pandemic, it's about criminal justice, which is an entirely different issue. Why does this make it very hard to aggregate preferences? Simply put, it means that people aren't actually representing their true preferences on the pandemic. If opening opposition wants to pigeonhole us and say any law now requires a referendum, fine. I literally do not care. That is how Switzerland does it. Like, it just does not matter. If their only argument is this takes more time, I think, number one, the opening government model about like emergency measures, we're fine supporting that. The second and more obvious thing is like, yes, we will spend the money, hundreds of millions of dollars, or like trinkets in like billions and trillions of dollars that you have at any given point in time. They do not have arguments that are about why direct democracy is actually bad, other than arguments that would also imperil their own case about why the status quo itself is bad, i.e. all the things about voter turnout just don't matter. Here is why this is the most important thing. The third thing I want to point out is that you have to become much more extreme on their side. Because in the absence of being able to grab attention and like a collected space of media attention on a referendum for a month at a time, you are jockeying with other issue groups. You are jockeying with other political positions in the news in order to be able to say, we care about things like COVID. So you become much more extreme because your response is not to give the measured approach. Your response is to grab the soundbite, to say, you are against us or you are with us. That happens on their side far more because the amount of time that you have is far less. I want to explain why we are so much better, because we create sustained buy-in. Number one, we make more misinformation challenge. You get an express place for public education versus soundbite clips that you just do not have on their side. That is the most important thing that opening government misses. It makes COVID policy not just less misinformed, but you are more likely to be able to convince people to buy into things once you actually have the regulations. But I think the second thing is just you get much more you are much better able to aggregate preferences. The second thing that I think is important is the popularity of COVID policies is massive and means that you get far less backlash against it. So the majority of people who are protesting at the trucker protests, it's such a small number of people, but their claim at every given point in time is we are the majority. We are the most number of people, we are the silent majority, and we have that claim, that democratic claim. And this is really important because the easiest way to actually fight these people is to hold referenda that are democratic, and I want to be clear, in our worst case, where you hold a referenda and you lose, it's inevitable because you would have done it in the election anyway. Closing then opening, closing.
Yeah, so just 32% of Americans right now don't believe the 2020 election was legitimate. What are those numbers going to be for anti-vaxxers on your side?
It literally does not matter because by your argument, that is for the election anyway. Guys, if you're marginal, you don't win there. Open it.
Okay, so in a referendum, Americans say they'll support Medicare for all, but won't say they'll support Medicare for all plus the taxes paid.
Amazing.
A holistic
This is fantastic. So, go ahead.
Okay, a holistic political policy of your economic policy plus your COVID restrictions is more democratic when people can go to the ballot box and say, was I better off last year as a result of this policy as opposed to voting on one issue?
So, number one, it is a good thing if we had more referenda on things like public health care. Just imagine how much better we would be if we didn't allocate money to people like Joe Manchin, who then take money from the oil lobby or fossil fuels or big pharmaceutical industries to then stop the democratic will of the vast majority of people. I would also point out the easiest response to opposition bench down the bench is governments are so screwed in terms of the actual representation. The Senate is so massively disrepresentative, it is insane. One person's voice in Wisconsin is worth more, 30 times more than someone's in California. I'd much rather have a referendum where you can accurately, properly assess things instead of having a skewed random parliament. Here is why this is better. Because what you do is not just get more buy-in for things like delegating powers opening government says, but you get sustained buy-in over time. Because as Hamza points out in the POI, you don't need people to agree to the first lockdown. You need them to stay in for the second and the third, and the only way you get that is when they trust the government more because they have voted for the policy themselves.
Thank you very much to the member for the government, and we invite the member for the opposition. Thank you.
Just before I begin, just for accessibility reasons, please no verbal POIs in the sense of don't say point or whatever. Just put up your hand. I promise I see you. I'll take one from each team. Thank you. Okay. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. Panel. CG doesn't need to worry about their third lockdown because they never get to their third lockdown, right? You're unlikely to have the first lockdown, and you're certainly unlikely to have the second and the third. There's a couple structural reasons for this. One, this is why politicians often avoid doing referendums just on base. There's a massive status quo bias, i.e. a vast majority, we're talking 80% of referendums worldwide, fail largely because people are often unwilling to change their status quo because it's better to stick with the devil you know than the angel you don't, right? People are far less often able to calculate that type of risk. But additionally, there's other strong reasons why they're unlikely to feel there's other reasons such as short-termism, an lack of statistical literacy. This is a good example. When you tell people that COVID has a 2% death rate, they go, oh, that doesn't sound too bad. When you tell them, if I had a jar of 100 M&Ms, 2 of them would kill you, would you like some M&Ms? They're like, oh my God, right? It's important to understand that people struggle to understand large numbers, these types of that thing. Like I think we all attended a lecture today about epidemiology. I got like 10% of it. I consider myself a relatively intelligent person who can follow those types of things. So I think it's important to understand these are things that the average person just just has a very low ability to process. We're going to engage with that more. We're talking about the difference between majoritarianism and democracy and why there's a massive important difference in this round and why they are defending majoritarianism and we are the ones defending democracy. But first, quickly with CG on the rest of the things that came out of CG, quick rebuttal. First thing to tell you is that these elections won't be about COVID. One, I think this is just like not true. I think it's pretty widely known that basically Joe Biden won because he was opposing Trump's COVID plans. Trump, if you don't believe this, Trump was headed for double-digit win before COVID happened based off all polling when he was up against Biden. Then it changed after he completely fucked the thing. Also, Canada alone, since we're talking about the truckers, which I assume that's a reference to it, has had 4 elections within the last 6 months all about COVID. Note, none of them required. The federal government and 3 provinces chose to have elections because they wanted to have this debate about that. And it was important for them because some governments fell, some didn't, largely dependent on their thing. I think the thing that killed tens of thousands of people is probably going to be the most dominant election issue. I think probably that's what most people care about. I think that's bought out in all the elections that happened last year. So this idea that it won't be the main issue, I think is a little bit ridiculous, quite frankly. Okay, then I'll move into my extension. The rest of the stuff I think is pretty integrated, but I'll take a POI from CG before.
People are bad at numbers, so they shouldn't vote in a referendum, but people charge them with the responsibility of electing someone who will do quantitative easing policy, epidemiological policy, and many other things.
I think this is important. I think this is why we do not put the interest rate to a referendum, because the average person probably cares more about, note this, the long-term preferences, am I alive, am I those type of things, rather than the mechanism. People care about their end state, not about specifically how they got there. That's why we elect politicians to make those hard decisions for us. On your side, it's unclear why every election shouldn't be like, would you like this interest rate versus this? Would you like this tax policy with this? Why politicians at all? I'm going to explain that now. There's a note that this is important. The difference between majoritarianism, i.e. just rule of the many, versus democracy has checks and balances. And note, this goes above O's material because it isn't just saying, oh, we have other laws like emergency power acts, that thing. I'm going to give you the actual principled reasons for why we have those laws. The first one, it isn't just a balancing of rights, I mean how many dead people versus how many masks were removed, but specifically the idea that we all know without a Supreme Court, and that's why that wasn't model quibble, it was specifically why do you value at some points a few people's rights over the majority's interests? It's because that's what separates a democracy. This is important because this is what allows you to make the decisions on behalf of the few, again, the marginalized people, the communal compromise, polarized. Note people who die the most, i.e. immigrants who can't vote in Canada, are the people who die the most likely. The people who are on farms working seasonal work are the most likely to be injured. These are the types of people that you need the protections of politicians and courts to make those decisions. It's unclear how any of that happens when presumably all these things are binding by referendum. It's unclear why there's a Supreme Court check at all if the only thing that matters is aggregating the preferences of the masses. That's what they're defending, majoritarian. So don't let them try and take democracy. Democracy is our side. It's about checks and balances. It's about balancing rules of law and those types of things. Okay. I think this is really important because I think I'm going to do some characterization of the different places we're talking about. Because I think there's been a lot of talk about COVID in Canada, COVID and things. Let's talk about what I think are the different categories, where this case applies, why it applies most. I think the two main things we can start with is polarization. What states are already polarized, in which healthcare politics is like a massive thing, versus not. So I think a place like South Korea has had little debate about particularly healthcare policies compared to like Canada and the US, other differences like that. I think in the places where it is already a polarized issue, you now risk embedding it forever, i.e. now that this is a policy going forward, every couple of years you have a vote on a referendum. Note that the long-term damages of polarization are often worse than just the pandemic immediately, because it literally fractures your politics forever. You risk embedding that fracturing forever in already polarized countries when you now literally make this like a cyclical part of being in that democracy where every time the government wants to do any kind of healthcare policies, because guess what? I hate to tell you, this isn't the last outbreak we're going to have. They're likely to do more. But what you also risk is in unpolarized countries making it an issue, i.e. referendums are always political. Why is this the case? Because even if you don't care about what's on the ballot, it's a chance to screw people over. There's a reason why Boris Johnson jumped on the Brexit wagon, and it wasn't just because he's like he hates the EU, though that's probably true to some extent. It's also because he wanted to unseat David Cameron, which he was able to do, and move into a position of power eventually after a couple of prime ministers. These are important because these things will always be polarized, and they will always become a partisan issue or a polarized issue and break along political lines that are extremely dangerous and threaten to fracture the country forever. Go ahead.
Why would I, a healthy white person, not care about all the people dying of COVID in a referendum, but suddenly care so much about it 2 years later when it comes to a general election?
This is actually very important because you actually probably also care about the taxation policy, you also care about the other things. We're not noting that those things don't play a role, we just think it'll be one part thing. This is also important because then the people that it matters most with the healthcare policy can vote on that, but the people who have other interests can vote on those other things. But note, all of that is I would rather have that decided by everyone and different politicians than just take a gamble on whether or not the white person cares enough in the single referendum where they're probably unlikely to care. At least they can be like, well, yeah, but my guy has the right healthcare or the right tax policy. We should vote together even if we disagree on pandemic response. I think those are probably things. So, in places, and here let's do some more like categorization of different places. In places with skeptics in power, i.e. people who are questioning science and those types of things, so Republicans, Boris before he got the bug, those types of things, I think it is important because it gets worse. Note the worst COVID response of all is no action. This is the things that are most likely. The only thing worse than repeated lockdowns or changing lockdowns, and note that changing expectations are terrible, but the only thing worse is no expectations. But even the people who aren't skeptics are going to be very wary to put their popularity, their political futures on the line to impose measures. Thus, they're likely to take the least hands-off policy, not make it a referendum, and in the end, cost lives for their own political capital. Politicians are selfish, but so are people. We like the status quo. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the member of the opposition, and now you might allow me to
I think instead of investment clubs, it should say debate society. They do not trust me to fly an airplane, but they trust me to pick a pilot. They do not trust me to have empathy for people in a referendum, but they trust me to have empathy for people in an election on several more issues. Yeah, things like that. The point here is that it's completely symmetric on both sides insofar as the capture of democratic opinion is concerned. We completely agree, democracy is a fundamentally imperfect process. The question then becomes, how do you best capture democratic opinion while guaranteeing public health outcomes? That's what I'll attempt to prove to you. The first thing that I want to say there is that elections, as Aditya says, are institutionally flawed. So for instance, the Electoral College systematically locks out several people from having their voices represented. The first past the post system in the United Kingdom and many democracies in Europe systematically locks out people who voted for 30% of the vote share as opposed to just 31%. It's crazy things like these in elections which mean that you never get your democratic preference satisfied as opposition bench wants them to. Number two, apart from it being institutionally invalid, there's also a host of different issues that are at play. I agree that the pandemic was probably on a bunch of people's mind in November 2020. I think the point that Aditya was making was that 40% of people in America will never vote for any other party but the Republican Party because of abortion, right? Like that's just realistically the case. So the issue here is that you're supposed to aggregate the preferences of everything you want to do into one vote. And that's a really difficult thing to do during a crisis. Hence, a second reason why elections are not a great way to provide accountability in the context of a pandemic crisis. These two reasons mean that insofar as opposition bench's claim is concerned about accountable policy, and insofar as that's a metric of good policy, they do not have accountability. The second way that you can gauge democratic opinion is how many people are talked about outside elections and referenda. What we said to you was, when you have a protest outside the White House, it's 100,000 people. When you have a poll, statistically it tends to be 10 to about 25,000 people who are in any given poll. What that means is that in normal routine times, because elections happen at longer time intervals, the opinion that's being captured is a very minute representation of the general democratic polis. This is the second reason that Aditya gave you, that all captures of other public opinion outside elections tend to be anti-democratic. So we need something that's speedier, we need something that's faster, and we need something that's more consistent. These three reasons show to you that on the democratic end, it's better to capture opinion in that sense. The second thing I'm going to do is devote the rest of my speech to showing you how public health surveillance is better for closing government's work. Before I do that, I would love to engage with the POI.
Okay, even if 40% of people vote Republican regardless, politicians are still scared that 10% of those people will see their immunocompromised cousin die in the next 2 years, and then that might be the voting issue for them. It doesn't even have to be, it just might be, and they make better decisions because it probably will be.
This is a broader question, right? Because there's this thing called like the Alman-Lippmann consensus, which just means voters make stupid decisions because they're individual people. I just don't think that's the case, right? Like if you historically look at referenda, like people were against the Vietnam War more or less 2 years after it started. Look at the war in Iraq. Like I just think people make individually very empathetic decisions because people, just because one person is one person doesn't mean they make a decision for one person, right? They're making decisions for their families. They're making decisions for the people they work with. They're making decisions for their communities because no man is an island. So a lot of these decisions are an aggregation of preferences. Every single person who votes for someone is thinking that they're voting for everyone. So I think what this point of information assumes and what the opposition bench case broadly assumes is that just because it's one person means that they're literally only voting for their self-interest, which I think is a silly way to think about the expression of democratic opinion. On public health surveillance then, 4 points. The first thing I want to say is about public stamina that Aditya brought up, because this is mission critical. The issue right now is that you cannot get public health surveillance which has continuity or sustenance because what happens is you have one lockdown and people are like, we've had enough, we don't want this anymore. What changes now is people own their decision. People voted for this power to be given to this government for this time interval, whether it's a year or a couple of years. What that means is that the government has policy space. They have more and more time to sustain that policy making. Because I agree with closing opposition. The only thing worse than no lockdowns is one lockdown and then doing nothing again, right? What we want to do is give the government that policy continuity. Note, they don't get that because of their electoral claim, right? Precisely for the reasons that they would vote against a referendum are the reasons that they would vote against them in the election. So presumably the cases that we're talking about are somewhere in the middle. And there, I think, giving people a voice is what allows them to have that stamina in the first place. Before I deal with the other 3 reasons why we get better public health outcomes, closing opposition.
So if polling is so unreliable, how can you be so sure that 68% of Californians, like you say, are going to vote to pass the referendum?
Oh, no, I completely agree with you, but think of the counterfactor, right? Like, imagine electing a conservative candidate who never does anything during the pandemic. So that's the sort of point that we're trying to make, because if you want to be fair about this debate, and we can have multiple referendums, and we're supposed to, then presumably if we get a no in 6 months, and in 6 months we can have a referendum again, whereas in your case you can't, because you're stuck with one person for 4 or 5 years, no matter who they were, and no matter how bad they were. The entire point that we're trying to make is that you should be allowed to update your democratic opinion insofar as your personal situation is concerned, because referenda is rapidity, referenda is response, in a way that elections can't be, because elections by their own terms are fundamentally retrospective, which I think is really important. 3 additional reasons here. Number 1, you politically educate yourself on the issues. Yeah, you have 2 weeks. That's 2 weeks more than you're getting in their world, right? So if a referendum is going to come up, you are realistically going to think about what the pandemic is about. Compare this to an election, because you're also looking at the interest rate, you're also looking at the economy, you're also looking at jobs. You're looking at a host of different issues to educate yourself in, but here you can hone your educational capacity towards specifically and only looking at the pandemic. Number 3, you get public health outcomes which are better, because the right is not ideological. It's not like Ted Cruz grew up hating a mask, right? Like, the issue here is that Ted Cruz thinks that's going to win him an election. Look at what happened with the Labour Party in Brexit. The Labour Party has gone pretty silent on Brexit now, because for better or for worse, the Democratic Polis voted for it. That's what they wanted Republicans in the context of public health surveillance. If the referendum is one, the right will update its opinion, because it's so clear in an institutional referenda that that's what the broader public wants. That's how we get better policy. Panel, how much time do I have?
6:50.
Oh, amazing. Panel, look, this should say debate society instead of investment club. I'm going to end with that, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much to the government. If we can zoom in and now we invite the opposition to close up this debate. Thank you.
Is it okay if I put this on the ground? I think that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to like face HWS property, but I can.
Alarm goes off.
Yeah, it's like- Okay, I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. Alright, let's start with the CG, then talk about OO, and then get on to OG. Let's get right into it. Alright, I think the major push that CG makes is that governments are unrepresentative and elections are not a fair representative of the people. I think the really important thing we tell you, the difference between direct democracy that they want to defend and representative democracy on our side of the House, is that sure, you have rule of the majority on our side, where yes, maybe not the majority of people voted for Joe Biden, etc. I think the Electoral College is like specifically fucked up. We can say like, we probably defend like slightly better versions of democracy than that. But specifically, you have restrictions on the ability of that majority to enact like things on the minorities. Whereas I think for every other democratic mechanism, the point of representative democracy is you have limits on what you can do on minority populations and things like constitutions and courts that limit your ability to enact that majoritarian rule. The more you slide towards direct democracy, which CG wants to defend pretty much in its entirety apparently, they literally said they're down with like every law being defended by direct democracy, is that you lose that ability to represent the will of minorities, to have protections against them. That's the really important material that Carl brings to you that I don't think gets officially engaged by the whip whatsoever. Alright, let me tell you, people will comply more because they've voted for it and they've had their voice spoken, they're likely to buy in. I think people are far more likely to buy in when they view something as a technocratic decision made by public health experts versus a carefully calculated political decision put forward by a politician and then proposed as referendum. So all those political incentives that Carl talks about are so important. I'll come back to those again in a second. Alright, they tell you in the status quo you hear anti-lockdown voices more, and that's a disproportionate impact on politicians. just unclear to me how this ever manifested. Like, Trudeau didn't just cave to the trucker convoy, right? Because he knew majority of people weren't the trucker convoy. They literally did me the statistics that presumably their government also has access to. The majority of people are generally in favor of COVID measures. Unclear again why polling is so terrible, but it's also a crux of their case. That's like the actual representative of the majority of people. I don't think that really makes sense either. Alright. I also think we reach a critical problem with government's case where they tell you that people are not single issue, or are single issue voters, not COVID single issue voters, for example, Republicans with abortion, but also that our assertion that a lot of people vote against COVID measures can't work. Understand this logic, right? The point is that if people don't just vote based on COVID, the anti-vaxxers are probably voting on abortion on our side of the house. We proved to you why then, maybe elections are not going to be referendums on COVID, but we specifically proved to you that referendums on COVID are almost never going to actually enact public health measures for all the reasons Carl gives you. Things like status quo bias, things like the inability to understand statistics and that kind of thing. So even if you buy that at no point are we getting like necessary accountability on COVID in elections, because people are probably voting on either side on a myriad of issues, you don't ever get any solvency of public health measures on their side of the house when politicians are not willing to bring those measures forward in the first place because they're likely to be stricken down for the reasons we've told you. I think we're willing to defend that. They agree no measures are the worst thing. I think that's really important in this debate. Alright, what do we bring you that's more important than opening opposition? I think we bring you important expansion on two claims. First, on majoritarianism and why that's a negative form of majoritarianism versus democracy, and then on polarization. I think really critically, we've told you that it's far more likely in a representative democracy system where most things are determined by representatives who are democratically elected, you get more accounting for things like minority rights, right? First of all, I think you're likely to aggregate your premises to include minorities and sorts of things, but also you just have more direct constraints and protections and on the creation of legislation versus a referendum, right? There are things like literally constitutional minority rights that you cannot infringe upon that are more likely to be upheld there. Also, I think it's just true that you can lobby and have influential power as a minority group on a democracy far more than you can in a referendum. I think that's very disproportionate on their side of the house. You're much more likely to get representative actual minorities, and that's the difference between direct democracy, majoritarian systems, and actual representative democracies that we defend on our side of the house. That's really important. Okay, we also give you a lot of material, I think, that is substantially different than opening opposition on polarization, right? They basically tell you, the Quebec referendum happened and people still hold grudges. They don't explain why that's the case or why it's likely to be the case in this situation. That's what Carl does to you, right? I think we explained how you bake polarization into the question of public health in the first place, and why that's likely to lead to larger problems in terms of public health discussion in the future, where it's now viewed as part of the culture wars. Literally, wearing a mask is an indication of whether or not which side of the culture wars and woke debate that you're on right now. I think that's where we went wrong, right? The place where we now say this is an indication of your political leanings, or this is a political debate versus a pretty technocratic discussion that's largely led by public health experts, as opposed to a distinct representation of your political beliefs and which political party you side with. I think that's far worse. I think that's where we reach a big problem. This also changed politicians' incentives, which is what Carl tells you, right? You are unlikely to propose legislation that you believe, or a referendum like a public health measures that you think are likely to be voted against, and therefore you will be risk averse in terms of proposing any whatsoever. You will also be very unlikely to propose secondary measures after your first ones if you won on a slim margin and you're worried you'll lose this time. So we never even get to the third lockdown they're so worried about, because you rarely get the first one, you absolutely don't get the second one. That's far worse. I'll take CG first. Go ahead.
90% of the time, you listen to vocal protesters, which is why Florida overturned their mask mandate. When there is an election, people make worse, more misinformed, and less educated choices, and crucially, they are stuck with that choice for 5 years and cannot take back their vote for Trump.
Okay, so, I think the idea of, the referendum campaign that they try and tell you, you have a month-long referendum, you know what's really fucking long is elections, right? In the US especially, you have a lot of time to do that education if you want, right? The main mechanism they give to you why people are more informed in a referendum is because they're, a long process. I think we're very likely to get similarly, long education. People can aggregate their preferences over those 5 years. They had to prove to you more mechanism than just the, education campaign, which they relied on in their case. I don't think that works. I'll take OG, go ahead.
We say, and see to repeat for 6 minutes, that giving people control is what allows them to learn about and participate in laws. This is logically part of your best case scenario that general elections leads to laws protecting tiny minorities.
Cool. So I do think this is the problem with opening government, which is the idea that like the reason why you should have a vote on this is because it has a direct effect on your life. I think this again applies to pretty much everything governments do, which I don't think is a sufficient principled defense for the push that op benches made throughout the debate, which is like, why shouldn't you vote on criminal laws, for example, when the government can lock you up, or the taxes they collect from you? Again, CJ I think does the noble thing, which is just defend that we should vote on all of that, which has all the problems we've told you about on closing opposition, right? I think that's the problem like OG has not defended throughout this debate whatsoever. I also think they tried to preempt this idea of polarization by saying like Brexit wasn't super polarized. I know that he's British and I'm not, but I'm pretty sure that's just not true. Like Brexit was pretty controversial, right? It's pretty political. And the underlying issues, even if Brexit isn't talked about that much, things like immigration policy and the relationship with the EU is still pretty controversial and problematic. I think that's what we will see happen to things like public health policy if we entrench these in this badly. The last thing I want to point out about OG is their last argument is that you'll get better health policy on their side of the house, and yet a lot of their case is predicated on the fact that they think there is no superior objectively health policy, so that it's all kind of a series of trade-offs. I think that's a really big problem for their case as well. Really proud to have done it.